Hello, everybody present here, and the dignitaries that we have with us. Meaning and interpretation, films and arts. That's the theme of this particular session, sub-theme, I would call it. And I would first like to invite Bhavana ma'am to express her views on the topic.
No, so I was just saying that I was hoping that you would start with somebody else so that I save my voice, but doesn't matter. See, frankly, I don't know. The word literature seems very heavy loaded, and one doesn't know if one is really qualified to talk about it. But since it's the topic, I will only say in the beginning that I recently watched a film called Manto, where Sadat Hassan Manto says that literature has to change with times. And if literature doesn't change with times, then it is not literature. You have to identify in the new generation, in the new millennium, what the writer was trying to say. It cannot be something so static and so sacrosanct that the next generation needs translators on it. So I watched a film last week, another one, not Manto, called Pataka, which is also based on a short story. And at the end of the film, I'm asking myself, so what's going on? Because it's about two sisters who fight with each other and hate each other with passion, and there is no real trigger for it. There is no logical explanation given, there is no sub-story, there is no subtext to it. So I was just wondering while watching the film that maybe it worked as a short story at that time when it was written. But today, watching it on the big screen, again and again and again, them hurling abuses at each other and them fighting out so aggressively, so passionately, what is it accomplishing? What is the purpose at the end of it? I'm sitting in urban India watching a film, unable to identify with it. And then I said, maybe I'm a minority. And then, of course, I sought solution in the fact that Manto said that literature has to change with times. So I would say that in any art form, literature has to be moving, and every generation must be able to follow it without explanations, translations, or interpretations. Something that goes deep into my heart, something that touches me, something where I feel uplifted, elevated, is, I think, literature.
Thank you so much, Bhavana ma'am. I would like now, I request Alka ma'am to speak a few words on the role of art historian in creating art history. The agenda, the political stance that an art historian would like to take.
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, because what I would say as an art historian in this country, the interpretation and the reading of art, whether it's archaeology, temple sculptures, or even the reading of miniature paintings and sculptures, to a large extent has been written by our colonial masters. If you see most of the texts which I studied while studying art history, whether it was temple architecture, it was by Percy Brown. Whether it was painting, it was by Barrett and Gray. And when I was at the Ashmolean this time in Oxford, I saw a huge collection of Indian art, which was collected by Barrett and Gray and Mildred Archer. They had done most of the work on the Punjab hills. We did have a generation of Indian art historians like Kal Khandalawala, Moti Chandra, a very interesting man by the name of Anand Kumaraswamy, of a Sinhalese mother and a British father. But the way they kind of wrote art history, even most of us who studied in post-independent India, we were reading art historical interpretations which had been written by people who had come into India. Now, I'm not saying that foreigners cannot write about history of another land. Please don't misunderstand me there. But what I'm saying is that because art history as a subject was not part of traditional Indian academia, so we've had history, we've had sociology, we've had Elvin writing on anthropology and tribal art in a different way. But how are we as Indians looking at it from the inside? So this is very, very interesting, the question that there are going to be new writings in art history, new representations of cultures of display. Earlier, you exoticized. You know, all what we knew about Indian art and culture were from the British gazettes, the British tribes of India, where I think the Indian art was actually exoticized. That's why you have a book called Much Maligned Monsters, which has been written by an Indian art historian who's based out of England. So you see a lot of writing on art history, the agenda of art history is being relooked and re-evaluated. And I think we are in very interesting times, because today we as Indians are taking ownership of what we have, and we are not looking at the white Western world to canonize our art. I'm not saying that Sheldon Pollock does not know enough Sanskrit, or he doesn't, you know, or Wendy Doniger has not known enough about Shiva. She has also written about the erotic ascetic. So has Stella Kramrisch. But the readings and interpretations of Shaiva Bhakti, the way it is done in India, also needs a trajectory by the Indian scholars. Now, the problem in India, as I see it, is the people who know Sanskrit do not know enough English for the information to be disseminated in a proper way. So then comes another role of translators. Are there good translators who can disseminate knowledge? Because you have to speak in the knowledge of the common man or the common woman. So everybody cannot understand the dense Sanskrit which is there, where a lot of our information, a lot of Indic wisdom, a lot of Indian philosophy, to go back to the Vedas, to go back to the Upanishads, to go back to our Puranic stories, you need a good body of translations, not only the Gita Press, Gorakhpur. So these are very, very important issues, and we are at a very, very interesting time in art history, where for the first time a lot of us are taking ownership, because it's very important to take ownership and to just hark back at the wonder that was India, what A.L. Basham wrote. I don't believe in that either. I do believe that there is a wonder that is India. I do believe that there is a very, very important rereading of our culture, which is important at this moment, and there's a great need for it.
Thank you so much. You spoke about revisiting the past,
Yeah.
rereading, reviewing.
Yeah.
Considering the present ideology or the way the things are going on in our nation, will this sort of ideology be conducive? Will it create a conducive atmosphere to have the artist's agenda, or will it have a national agenda?
See, the problem I have at the moment is that there is the ideology which is going on, this great Hindutva ideology is one ideology. I think there has to be space for other ideologies as well.
Yeah.
There has to be space for foreigners writing on us. There has to, as we write about them, there has to be space for people with a more liberal mindset. Artists should be allowed to create what they do, and you cannot, if you see two two very important judgments have come out, which have been wonderful. One is the decriminalization of Article 377, which is so beautifully written. I mean, yesterday, as Gurcharan said, unfortunately, they did not have access to our Sanskrit text, but even then it's sheer poetry. And the other thing, which is on adultery, which is no longer offense, this is all, yes, this is all part of our very inclusive culture. Very, very inclusive culture. And in today's agenda, I do not see inclusiveness. So what is very important is that if we are having an agenda, we should have the courage to let other people also, their voices also be heard. What is true knowledge? If you go back, whoever is pushing the agenda today, in those times, look at the context. There were always debates and discussions. Adi Shankaracharya, debate and discussion. There should be a space for debate and discussion. Our country is a country of tolerance and acceptance, and I do not like the word tolerance either, because it can be rather, you speak from a level, oh, we are tolerating you. No, it's about acceptance. We have to accept and respect the other. So in that way, if we have a strong nationalist agenda, we have to respect the other agenda, because what does India stand for? A plurality and cultural inclusiveness and cultural diversity. So these things have to be looked at in the context in which they were produced. That is very, very important.
What about the right to be heard?
That's very important. The right to be heard and compassionate listening. These are very important things. And that is what the agenda of Hinduism is. It's a way of life. It's not a religion. So I want to make that very clear.
But considering the present scenario, what we talk about, the national scenario, do you think that there's a lot of distortion of what real Hinduism is, the way the things are going on?
I think there's just a single-minded one track, which I'm not against, not at all. Everybody has a right to say what they want, but they don't have the right to silence the other.
Yes,
that's the
very true,
thing.
very true.
That's
very
what
true.
I want to say. Whether you like it or you don't,
Yes.
you must hear and you must accept. It can't be my way or the highway.
But who has the power of silencing others?
Lots of things. Lots of things. There is a huge silence in the country at the moment.
That's don't you think that it's dangerous for a democracy? Because what I see is the democratic structure is there.
I think that lies with the people.
Yeah, the
because we are a
is-
democracy.
yeah.
It lies with the people.
Yeah, but the structure is there, but the present culture doesn't seem to support
But
the
the people
democratic
are all
structure.
here. It's the voice of the people. The people have voted.
Yeah, so they are they deserve.
Every human being, every citizen of India is responsible for this. You cannot say they, it is us.
So the change has to come from within.
Absolutely.
Would you like to say that?
Yeah, I would say each one of us.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for these, revolutionary thoughts.
Thank
rather. I would like Paula to speak a few words on the inspiration of her writing, or what motivated her to write the way she writes.
Thank you very much. I just want to say a lot of what you're saying is of great interest to me, because much of it relates to New Zealand as well. Now, unlike India, we are not the world's largest democracy. We're one of the world's smaller democracies. But, we also come from a place colonized by the British, and where the effects of colonization are ongoing. You just have to look at the bookstall here at the festival to see that. All these Indian writers I'm seeing in your bookstore, I don't see in my bookstores, because the only Indian writers I get to read are the ones that have been published in London or New York. And that's still how in the Commonwealth we end up waiting for London to make decisions about us, even when we don't realize it. Also, this notion of looking at your culture and interrogating it or examining it from the inside is absolutely essential. I mean, for so long, we've had other people write about us and dictate how we are portrayed and perceived. I'm from the South Pacific, another place that is very exoticized. Often people use the term Pacific Rim. Have you heard that term, Pacific Rim? It really annoys me. It's as though the Pacific is empty. What about all the islands in the Pacific with their cultures and their histories, their languages, their stories? But no, we just think about the big countries that go around the edge of it. Recently I was, I know this is not really answering your question. Recently I was asked to be a judge for the Commonwealth Short Story Award. You may be familiar with it. It's run by the Commonwealth Foundation from London, and there are regional judges. So I was the judge for Oceania, which is New Zealand, Australia, South Pacific. There was a judge for Asia, for Africa, these huge, huge regions of the world, the Caribbean and so on. And we got into some terrible arguments as judges because over the question of what is a story and what is a good story, and all the value judgments people bring from their own culture and background. And it was actually really a much more difficult process than I thought, because we couldn't really agree on what was a good story. So often people talk about literature being universal, but actually there are many particularities to it, and there should be, when we're looking at things from the inside rather than the outside. So I guess in my own work, my novels, my stories, my non-fiction, I am trying to, I suppose, subvert the way traditionally in New Zealand we wrote to get published in London. You know, that's something that's the old-fashioned way now. People don't talk about that in the same way. But to be on the inside of something that may not make sense to outsiders, that may not be comprehensible to outsiders, but that's still absolutely crucial if you're to have a vibrant culture and one that is not colonized, where our imaginations are not colonized.
That's very true. On the same line, the question about culture specificity. You mentioned about that, but not
Yes, this is a big debate in New Zealand. I don't know if it is here to the same extent. How culturally specific can you be in your books? Now, India is huge. I've just seen a little bit of it. It's already overwhelming. Everyone in India is driving very fast and talking on the phone as we speak. And I'm amazed that we all got here safely today. But and I will never, ever, ever drive here, just it's my little promise to you. But you have a large market here. So you can write books for Indians, you can make films for Indians, you know, that you have the market here. In New Zealand, we have 4 million people, which is what, about half the size of Pune, yes? And so for us, this argument about how culturally specific should you be is really an important one, because the more culturally specific you are, the less likely you are to be able to find a market for your books elsewhere. So do you write the books you want to write, or would you make the films you want to make, which, as you know, cost a lot of money, knowing that only a very few people will see it? Or do you do things that are designed for an overseas audience? And I think a lot of artists in New Zealand struggling to make a living have to go through that sort of moral and artistic dilemma all the time, what to do. And what some people do to try to have it all ways is to write things that are very general and vague and apparently are set nowhere, and I really don't care for that at all.
But on the one hand, we're talking about the minor cultures or the culture specificity of a particular region or a particular people. But on the very other hand, we are making blanketed statements, sort of thing, generalizations. So at times there's disparity in these two. So is it possible that we generalize or universalize on the basis of the majority and sidetrack the minority, as it has always been taking place in the human history?
Well, I don't know what my fellow panelists think, but generalizations are very tempting for people, aren't they? Mm-hmm. It's easier to see the world if you think generally, if you think in terms of types. But we all know, I mean, you all know better than anyone in this room, that people are individuals, that you're unique. You're all a bit weird, aren't you, in your own way, as we are up here. We all have our own strange families and our own particular histories. And I think when you start making generalizations, you start to, I mean, in politics, you go down a road towards totalitarianism where you think that there's one people. In literature, you make it boring and generic. I mean, the more that we understand and celebrate differences or recognize them, as you were saying, that's the first thing to do, the more rich a cultural life we have, and also the more complex we understand the world to be, which it is it not?
Yes, very true. I would like to ask Bhavana one question. Is it okay? Yeah. So the question is related to the point which Alka have made regarding this crushing forces of ideology of a nation and role of a creative writer.
See, I don't know about the crushing forces of ideology because my subject is cinema, so I can only move it around it. And what I feel, kind of elaborating on what the other two speakers said, is that whenever filmmakers have relied on the written word, on literature, and made movies, whether it was Satyajit Ray, or whether it was Gulzar Saab, or it was Rishikesh Mukherjee, somehow, even if it's an old film or an old story, it has worked. What is important is the emotion quotient has to be right. What is important is that relationships really don't change because human beings don't change. So the threads of feelings and emotions and families eventually is what binds us all, and that is what we look for in entertainment, or we look for in any form of art, or particularly movies. That is why Devdas has been made again and again and again by several filmmakers, not just in Hindi language, but down south, Bengal, of course. And every single time, the ethos has touched us. Though Devdas as a character is not really existing today. Nobody is drowning themselves for the sake of a paro. They are being seen at bars at night because they like to drink and have a good time.
Otherwise, they kill paros.
Yeah, and at the same time, it does not mean that just because literature is married to the celluloid, it is always going to work. We've had instances when it has not worked. For example, Saat Khun Maaf. Most of Vishal Bhardwaj's movies are from Shakespeare, and when he doesn't take it from Shakespeare and he takes it from elsewhere also, there is a kind of a misplaced emotion for him. Satyajit Ray's Shatranj Ke Khiladi was discussion because it was so superbly cast. It did not do well. My favorite instance at seminars like this is always of Charulata, because I don't know how many in this hall are aware of it, but what happened is when Satyajit Ray was making Charulata, written by Rabindranath Tagore, as a movie, is he changed the end a bit, because he felt that in the book, after the wife has kind of strayed, apparently, got attracted to her husband's friend, the husband is obviously upset, and it brings a crack in the marriage. And in the book, the last scene or the paragraph is where she opens the door and he's standing there, the husband. And it's left open to interpretation about whether he comes in, he fights with her, or he takes her out, or whatever. In the movie, what Satyajit Ray did was, she opens the door, the beautiful, what is her name? Madhavi Mukherjee. And the husband is waiting out at the door. And she just says, Ashi, means come in. Because Satyajit Ray felt that in the book, it is different if she just waits with the door open. But in movie, it needs that extra one line to interpret it differently, and he added Ashi, and my God, the Tagore fans and the Tagore devotees went completely mad, and there was a dharna and protest, and Satyajit Ray's movie was not being allowed to be screened, and finally Manikda had to write columns, explain himself, beg Tagore devotees to allow that thing, and it was an emotional explanation, and finally, of course, it was allowed. And today, so many generations watch Charulata. It's a must for any cinema buff. And I wait for the last scene to come, and I always look at that Madhavi Mukherjee's expression when she says Ashi. And see, what happens is the fabric of humanity, the threads that bind us, as I said, doesn't change. It's about interpretations, and it's about documentation. So whether it is me as a journalist who is writing on cinema and trying to document my time as a journalist, constantly putting it into books, not because I think that what I write is classic, but because I just feel, for example, I have written a book called Salam Bollywood, which is about my experiences as a journalist. So I wrote that book because I felt that a 20-year-old girl who comes into show business, who comes from a middle-class family, and who is interacting with the world that she has not ever dreamt of or exposed to, what she goes through, her complexities, her fears, anxieties, apprehensions, needs to be documented so that decades later, when another middle-class 20-year-old girl becomes a journalist, there is a Bible for her to follow, that she's not the only one who's feeling nervous, unconfident, unsure. All of us have gone through it, and it's all right, because you find your own roots and you find your own paths. When I interact with people like Gulzar Saab, who has done many of his cinema from literature, so he says that, you know, sometimes you get so attracted as a filmmaker by the book that you're reading, it is such an impactful experience for you that you have to just put it in your movies. So in fact, there are two movies, a lot of his movies are from literature. For example, Khushbu is also from literature. And there was another one where a portion of it is borrowed from, I think it was in Mausam, or it was in another one where Sharmila Tagore is there. I can't recall. And his most delightful experience was his film Meera, because everybody knows the story of Meera and Rana and how Meera had the pyala and her obsession with Lord Krishna. So there are many things and many layers to it.
I request you to elaborate on an incident or any experience.
Sorry?
I request you to elaborate on any experience of yours where what is perceived and what the filmmaker expected the people, the audience to perceive. There was a difference.
See, cinema is the most sensitive medium of art for sure, because it affects us in sound, image, content, thought, everything together. A painting speaks to you in a different way. So cinema is all about creating illusions and then breaking them. As far as your question of perception goes, the filmmaker is telling you his story through what he thinks he perceives. But as an audience and as a critic, I am allowed to perceive the same film in a completely different way. And a lot of time, that's what happens. The audience is taking the film in a completely different way. The interpretations are different. I'll give you one example. I remember watching Rishikesh Mukherjee's film a couple of times called Anuradha. Anuradha is a story of a singer who falls in love with a doctor, a revolutionary doctor, and she marries him, and then she settles in his village. So Anuradha is played by Leela Naidu, and Balraj Sahni is the doctor. Every time I watch this film, I'm filled with sadness. And Rishikesh Mukherjee has a habit of filling you with sadness. And he becomes such a busy doctor that he forgets that she is a singer, and then now she is so neglected and she's singing by herself. And then her old friend who had a crush on her visits her one day, and she's almost tempted to get out of the marriage and go away with this guy because he's giving her attention. I remember discussing this film with Jaya Bachchan, and I told her after a discussion, we were a part of the panel discussion, and I said, I am angry with Balraj Sahni because he's neglecting her and it's not fair. And Jaya said, I don't think he's neglecting her because he is working from morning to night for the upliftment of the villagers. He is serving selflessly and he is neglecting himself. It's not that he's having a good time and he is just being insensitive to her. Now for me, this was a revelation. I thought that because I was younger, I was perceiving it in a different way because she was a little older than me. And she gave me a new insight, which the filmmaker was not there at that time to give it to me. So I thought now when I watch Anuradha, I don't look at her as a victim. Similarly, in Abhiman, when she and Amitabh Bachchan play the singer couple, who apparently there is a kind of a competitiveness, and I don't feel sorry just for Jaya. I feel very, very sad for the husband because he's not a bad guy and he is a talented singer, but he is unable to cope with the mixed emotions he feels for his wife, and he needs help. And she is more evolved, she is more mature, and rather than just pack her bags and go away to her mother's house, if she had just hung around there, held her husband's hand, maybe the marriage would have taken a different turn. Maybe they would have not lost the child. So it's again how I'm perceiving it. And to give another example, Yash Chopra's Silsila is not based on literature. Yash Chopra's Silsila is not based on any, well, it is based on literature in the sense that any story that is about a triangle love story is Radha, Rukmini and Krishna. It is about the man loving two women. But I feel when people keep saying that Chandni, the character she played, is the other woman in their marriage, I think that Jaya is the other woman in the story because they already had something going, and because Shobha's husband, that is Shashi Kapoor, dies, and there is a situation, so it becomes a different story. So I feel life is very ad hoc. And literature is about life, and cinema is about life, and we keep debating whether cinema imitates life or life imitates cinema. There is no logical solution to it. It is everything. Cinema imitates life, life imitates cinema. It's all together.
Yes, very true. Life is ad hoc, as you said. Yes, very true. Taking on from this particular line, you talked about multiplicity of meaning or interpretation. How would an art historian deal with multiplicity of meaning or interpretation?
Again, a very, very difficult question. I don't know if there's that kind of multiplicity of meaning when I think it would be in both ways. Even if I'll now stick only to traditional art where there is text and image. Because if you look at the image making in sculpture, it comes from texts because the traditional artist, who was in some ways the Vishwakarma, read the text, meditated on it, and created a murti or a lila murti according to what he felt and produced it. It is up to the viewer to interpret it. In the same way, if you look at all the miniature paintings, whether it's the Ragamalas or the Baramasas or the Bhagavad Purans or the Puranic texts or the love stories which have been done, they were the personal interpretation of the artist who created them. The viewer looks at them. You have to be a rasika to enjoy this art. It is like classical music. you have to have a little bit of an understanding to know the rag pehchan, to know what a gamak is, what a murki is, what the nuances of art are. And for you, Paula, just to say that to understand Western classical, you have to know what a crescendo is and what a aria is and things like that. So I'm not saying that a person who isn't trained in music cannot understand classical music, or a person who's not read the scriptures or the Bhagavad Puran stories cannot understand the Leela of Radha and Krishna. I'm not saying that, or Vishnu's many manifestations or avatars on earth. So they can also look at it from a very naive perspective and just look at the beauty and the bhakti of it. Or they can look at it from an informed perspective where they know what the icons are, where they know what the stories are. And once they know the stories, then their interpretation is in a different way. There is a very interesting thing which my friend Lakshmi Vishwanathan, who's a Bharatanatyam dancer, saw this wonderful image of the Queen Sambian from the Chola period, and a beautiful Chola image which she sees at the Freer Gallery in Washington. And this woman is, and as was with a lot of Chola bronzes, whether it was a Parvati or a Gauri, she's shown without clothes, the breasts exposed, everything. So she's written this beautiful story of how Queen Sambian goes to the Walker Gallery, and how, you know, it is sad that she's there in that country and maybe she should come back. Somebody writes there saying, but she should be clothed. So you see, these are various, there is multiplicity of meaning, there is multiplicity of ideas, there is multiplicity of representations. It's everywhere because that's how it is. And India in particular is about storytelling, if you see that. There is Valmiki ka Ramayana, there is Tulsi ka Ramayana, and I can write my own Ramayana. This is what India is all about. So this is what I'm talking right from the beginning, whether it is about acceptance, whether it is an art, thought, ideology, or even in the cinematic process. Because as Bhavana said, cinema is the mother in some ways of all arts because it's got sound, music, enactment. You know, it's also very generic because the movie is not one person's. It's neither the actor, nor the director, nor the producer. It's a collective thing. Whereas art ownership can be taken between the patrons sometimes. Who is, which king has ordered? Like if you see the Pallava king, he ordered the making of Mammalapuram. Okay, so the patrons, the donors, they are always there. So it's like a client-based work, right? So they will, or Raja Raja Chola, Brihadeshwar temple. It was created over a victory, and it was done to, or the Alai Darwaza at Fatehpur Sikri, not the Alai Darwaza, sorry. The Darwaza at Fatehpur Sikri, commemorating Akbar's victory in Gujarat. So they were all commissioned works. So how much of it is true art? How much of it is being done at the price for which it is being paid? Because in India, if you look at throughout India, because patronage has always been there, whether today it's corporate patronage, whether it was royal patronage, but with that, there's also been complete artistic expression, say for example in Ujjain, Bhartrihari, Kalidas. So they wrote for their artistic freedom, and the king paid them and made them their Navaratans in their courts, but they always had artistic. So there is another different kind of interpretation of classical Sanskrit poetry. So, you know, India is so vast, it's so diverse. I mean, I find it a bit difficult to even, you know, answer these very important questions, because I can talk about objects, you know, say, so if you're looking at a Chola bronze, there is a different thing. If you're looking at the Maratha art, which was being done in Tamil Nadu, it was different, you know. There is a huge thing of the erotic and the spiritual. There's a huge thing of Shringar. So which trajectory are we looking at? What period of history are we looking at? Why was that artwork created? Who created it? What was the context? So you see, there are numerous stories and multiple meetings throughout.
Thank you. Very critically you spoke on all the whys, you know, about art, interpretation of art. Another question, the next question is to Paula. Paula, if you're asked to have multiple versions of your single piece of art, single fiction, maybe, work of fiction. Would you like to do it?
You mean if I could rewrite things?
Retelling the story, like Toni Morrison, trying to write the story from this point of view, this perspective. Would you like to do that? And if yes, how?
I mean, that question goes to the heart of writing fiction, does it not?
Yeah.
Because the most important thing for a fiction writer is point of view. I teach creative writing, and this is what we just talk about week after week. Who is telling your story? What do they see? What do they not see? What do they experience? What they have no idea about? It's the controlling mechanism through which we tell a story in fiction. Now, also then when we publish books, it goes out into the world. We have no control over the point of view of the people reading it, who may read it in any number of ways, may hate it, may love it. If they hate it, as you know, they go on the internet to tell everyone else, because that's why the internet was invented. So point of view is something we have to embrace both as writers and then as the producers of something that goes out into the world. Sometimes I write things that have multiple points of view for that very thing you're talking about, which is being able to tell a story from different angles. However, it's kind of the fiction writer's cheat in a way, because point of view is your chief constraint in writing. Just as in cinema, you can't be constantly showing what people think. You know, you have to reveal things through action and you know, other cinematic arts. But I don't know if I'm even answering your question. If I could I go back and rewrite all my books from other points of view? Absolutely. You know, because you finish a book and you think, oh, I'd quite like to have done this differently. And you know that the stories would be very different if they were told from somebody else's point of view. The British writer David Lodge makes this point about Flaubert's novel, Madame Bovary. He said if it was told from the point of view of the cuckolded husband, it would be quite a different novel.
Thank you so much. Yeah, now, that's the exact time for questions from the audience. So, okay, for the, yeah.
My question is for Paula. You were comparing and contrasting India to New Zealand, and then you said you suggested that it was a question of market. We have a large market here, and you have a very small market. But I was wondering whether it's only that, or is it also a question of identity? You know, because though New Zealand is colonized, or was colonized the way we are, but the history of colonization is different over there. And if you think of the Aboriginal people, there's a Maori writing, you know, writers like Scott Momaday and others. You know, would their writing differ from mainstream New Zealand writing? I must confess that I haven't read your work. So where would you place your own work? You know, would it be like Scott Momaday and other Aboriginal writers, or would it be more mainstream?
Okay, so, well, I'm a Maori writer, so I place myself within the groups of Maori writers in New Zealand. I don't know very much about Australian writing. I have to say this is another effect of colonisation, and that Australians and New Zealanders don't really read each other's books unless they've been published in London. So that's one of the many ridiculous things that we have to put up with. But you're right, there are more complex questions of identity. One thing we talk about in Australia and New Zealand, I'm sure, I don't know that you have it here, we talk about the cultural cringe. Do you know this concept? It means that you just automatically think that things from your own country cannot be quite as good as something from somewhere else. And so we are very much enthralled to overseas recognition. So if someone wins a prize overseas, or is cast in a movie in America, or has their book published in London, it's seen, well, that must be superior then. It must be a superior product, where in fact all it really is saying it's actually more mainstream, so it can appeal to more people. In New Zealand, though, as writers, you can never be mainstream, because you're always going to be obscure. I was at a party last Monday night, is that right? Maybe the Monday before, I don't even know. It was in New Zealand. And it was all patrons of our Writers' Festival. And I'm quite well known in New Zealand. But I was talking to this woman, I mean, relatively well known. Let's not get crazy. And she was a patron of the Auckland Writers' Festival, at which I've appeared for the last 6 years. And so someone said, oh, this is Paula, she's a writer. She said, hello. She said, and what are you working on now? And I said about the novel. And she said, is it your first book? It's like, no, it's my 8th novel. But anyway, so you're always reminded as writers how incredibly obscure you are. I think Joseph Brodsky says that if somewhere in the world right now, on every street there is a writer who is completely unknown to the majority of people on that street. And so we just have to really embrace that. So in answer to your question, I'm a New Zealand writer, I'm a Maori writer, I'm a woman writer. I'm also a Commonwealth writer in a way, I think. I lived a long time in America, and I think my work really shows the influence of a lot of American writers that I read. But like all of us, any artist is always going to be a complex mix of things.
But in terms of identity, so are you saying there's no sense of having a common identity with the British?
It depends on who you are, even within New Zealand, because my mother was English. So we were brought up to think we were English. We're not. Obviously, you go to England and realise you are not. Like, this country is strange. You can't take your shoes off. And so I think every New Zealander is going to have a different identity depending on their own heritage. Right. And we are going through our own moment right now with the acceptance of te reo Māori, the Maori language, which... I mean, there were big attempts made to kill it off. And my father grew up not speaking it at all, even though his mother was fluent in it. It's now coming back with a huge vengeance among younger people. And if you switch on New Zealand radio now, Radio New Zealand, our public broadcaster, you will hear people speaking it just as part of their greeting. A lot of kids are learning it at school. There's discussion as to whether it should be compulsory in school. So there's another cultural shift coming over the next 20 or 30 years. The other big cultural shift, and I'll stop because I know we're running out of time, is that in Auckland, where I live, 40% of the population right now is Asian, Maori or Pacifica. Within the next 20 or 30 years, the majority of people living in that city will be Asian, Maori or Pacifica. That will be a big, big change. It will make Auckland quite different from the rest of the country, but we're in flux, I think, as a country should be, really. We're not set in stone, so the country we're in, 1920 is not the country we are now.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. A wonderful session so far. Thank you to all of you. My question is a little bit on the subtlety of art and the different art forms. Where I'm coming from is, do you think that the audience of films, because this is more about film and the written word, but I would even extend it to somebody who's gone to watch a painting or a sculpture, and the audience of a film or a reader of a book, it might be the same person experiencing these different art forms. Do you think that their understanding, expectations, or the readiness, preparation to be able to take the subtlety or having, or expecting more to be explained, does it vary when a story gets made into a film or when a film gets written into a story? And if you may, I just want to add a personal, where I'm coming from. I happened to write a story which then got made into a film where I wrote the screenplay, and in fact my husband, he made the film. So it went to it was screened at the Cannes, etc. Then I got an offer to write it into a book, and then I wrote it into a book. And when the same people who watched the film earlier and now read the book, I felt that they were very insightful. Obviously, these are two different art products, no doubt. It is not a mirror reflection of each other. But somehow I felt that the same person expect more to be explicitly explained and written. And when they watch a good film or something, like you mentioned, Charulata or anything, that last scene where Bhupati and Charulata, the hands almost tend to meet but do not meet. We actually, get thrilled and we talk about that artistic expression, and we love that the director left us with a job to explain, think, and, interpret. But when it comes to written words, perhaps I have, maybe I'm wrong, perhaps we expect more to be told explicitly, more to be explained, illustrated, enunciated, or do you agree, and what are your comments on this, this subject?
I don't think it's a question. I think it was an expression. You have expressed it. And there's nothing for anybody else to add, because what you were just sharing your own experience, you are absolutely right. Because for a filmmaker, there are many other things to lend to a scene. But the writer has to write and explain. She has to talk about the hand when she's talking about a hand. She can't be showing a foot when she's talking about a foot. And as far as mediums of the same art is concerned, this is a very common thing now. You write it into a screenplay, it gets made into a film, and then there is a demand for it to be made into a book. Now it depends on the writer. If I am the screenplay writer and then I see it being made into a film by my husband or anybody else, but then I'm asked to make it into a book, I would get very bored. So I would not be interested. You did it, that's hats off to you.
I'd like to add to what you said. It's something very interesting, because in the art world, what is happening today, there are some artists who refuse to even write the captions. There was this artist who had come all the way from a small island like Malta, and he had done a wonderful, wonderful exhibition on migrations, particularly in the Mediterranean. And there is a whole problem there between Syria and migrations and crossing the river. And he was using maps. And when you looked at the work, it was absolutely beautiful. And I was looking at the work, and I really couldn't get into the skin of the work. And then I heard him telling people on the way he had used and the process of the work. What he had done was that he had used old maps. He had worked on those old maps through a printmaking process. Then he had used some of the bullets which had pierced, he had done bullet piercings in that, which was just not explained. So when I asked Austin, why did you not give a concept note? He said, no, I don't want to. I want people to understand it and react to it as they want to. I said, but they don't know the context. It's like the river of pain which was shown at the Kochi Biennale when they were crossing that. That could still, because it was an immersive experience and you understood the river of pain and you understood the crossing of the Mediterranean, so you could understand. But Austin's work, and he was right in his own way. He said, I don't want to explain. Let the audience come. But if the audience has no understanding of the materiality of the process, how do they even get any kind of experience? In a cinematic thing, you cannot use the same parameters in different mediums. Every medium has its own language. And because it has its own language, it has its own codes. And those codes of understanding are very important. So when you are looking, for example, if you're talking of Charulata or any other film or your own film, you know, there are contexts to it. And there is that's where the multiplicity comes. The writer has a different way of expressing. The director has the artistic license. Often it's very different. That's why it reminds me of the joke when a goat is eating from the trash can the film. So he says, how did you like the film? The goat says, the book was better. So, you know, this is just on a light-hearted note. I'm just expressing it. But there is huge differences of understanding. You have for me, I'm talking of myself, because anybody who's in the arts, and I go back to the Natya Shastra, where there is the performing, there is the dance, because all our aesthetics of understanding comes from the rasa theory, which is vested in the Natya Shastra, which is one of the texts of dramaturgy, and it talks of everything. Even in dance, it talks of Natya, Nrita, and Nritya. So you come from pure dance to where there is movement and expression, which is Nritya, and then you come to Natyam. So therefore, to understand Indian aesthetics, you have to go back into that manner. So that is my way, because I am, in some ways, I go back to the Natya Shastra to actually understand and interpret the wonder that is India, the wonder that is of Indian expression and Indian aesthetics. I want to understand it in the context in which it was born, and then take it to a universal, more global, cosmopolitan internationalism which is existing today. So your point for me is very, very important, that there are certain things which need explanation, certain things. For a thing like a movie, you don't really need it because it's got everything. But even a painting, suppose you look at a image, a Chola bronze, is it a Parvati? Is it a queen? Is it a Gauri? What is it? So the context has to be understood, and then the interpretation is the viewers.